Hello and welcome to this video about the intermediate CSS. In the previous videos, we talked about the responsive design and flexbox, CSS box model, display and positioning properties, and some fundamentals about the CSS. In this video, we're going to extend our knowledge about the CSS and walk into some concepts that are more advanced compared to fundamentals. These concepts will help us to understand the CSS better. Just like other sections, I have the style.css file, which is empty currently, and I have reference.css file inside my HTML file. I'm going to collapse the sidebar and move the CSS file to the side to see the both files at the same time. I'm running my HTML file with the live server extension, and I can see the preview in the browser right here. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about the first concept called Combinator selector. So I'm going to paste some code here. It is just a div element that contains a p and span tag, and then outside of this div we have a paragraph tag. I'm going inside style.css and I'm going to select the p tag, and then I'm going to add the color blue. So I'm selecting the paragraph tag and adding the color of blue. So in the preview you can see I have these texts all in blue. If I open the DevTools and if I select them, you can see I have the p tag, the span tag, and then this p tag here. Inside the span, you can see I have a p tag. Alright, so in CSS, we have a concept called Descendant selector, meaning that we can select the p tag only inside the div element. So every single paragraph tag will be selected, but nothing outside of this div element. So we can select these p tags here, but not this one. And to do that, we can combine the selectors. So we can say a div and then the p tag. This means every single p that exists inside this div element. If we take a look at the preview, now you can see this is not blue because this p tag is outside of this div element. Alright, so another concept that we have is we can add an angle bracket, like an arrow pointing to the target. So this means that the p tags that are direct children of this div element. And by the way, in VS Code, if you hover your mouse over the selectors, it will clearly show you the purpose of the selector. Now if I remove this angle bracket and I select that, you can see it adds this 3 dots here. Means every p tag inside the div element. And if I add this one, it will show you the div and the p inside, so the direct child. And if we take a look at the preview, this time you can see only this p tag, this one, is blue, because this is the direct child of this div element, and this p tag is inside the span. So let's say we want to select only this p tag. What we're going to do is we're going to say div span p. If I add a span here, you can see only this element is blue now. So this means every span element that we have inside the div that has a direct child of paragraph element. Now we also have another selector called Sibling selector, and it has this plus symbol. If I hover my mouse over this, it shows that the div and p both are at same level. We have this. We have a div element here, and after the div, we have this paragraph tag here. So this is exactly the selector for this outer p tag. If we take a look at the preview, you can see this one is now blue, which we have this div, and after that we have this one. So this is called the Sibling selector. Just note that this will only work if p is after the div. So if I copy this element and put it before the div, this way you can see we added this one before the div. If I select that, you can see we have a p before the div. It's not blue. Only the paragraph that comes after the div is blue. That's because of this plus symbol. Note that this p tag should directly come after the div element. So as an example, if I added span here like a, in the preview you can see this is not blue. The reason for that is because there is a span in between. And if I remove the span, now it becomes blue. But with tilde, if I add a tilde here, this says no matter what is in between, any p tag that comes after the div element will be selected. So this way, if I reload this, now even though we have an 8 in between, this is still blue. Alright, so let's move on to our next topic about the attribute selector. I'm going to remove everything that we have here and also remove everything that we have inside HTML. Let's go ahead and create a button here, and let's say submit for the first one and duplicate it down and create another one for the reset like this. And for the second button, let's add a type of reset. Now in CSS, we can select the buttons here based on the types that they have. If I say button and add the background color of light coral, in the preview, you can see both have the same color. If I add a bracket here and copy the exact same attribute inside, this time only the reset button has this light coral background. So this is called an attribute selector. Basically, we select the element, and inside the brackets, we provide the attribute and its value. And we can select elements based on their attributes. Now we have also some utilities for this attribute selector. Like we can select that attributes that start with a certain value or end with a certain value. Just because I want our documentation to be complete, I have included them inside the attribute selector section here in the intermediate CSS section. So as an example, here you can see this is the start with. So if we provide this caret here, we can say the attribute that starts with this value. Or we have ends with. If we use this $sign after the attribute, we can say, okay, attributes that end with this value. And we also have the contain. If we provide this asterisk or the star character, we can say attributes that contain this value. So these are the utilities that we have for attribute selection or targeting based on the attribute. All right, so let's move on to an important topic called pseudo-classes. Now, pseudo-classes are used to define special states of an element. The pseudo-classes are everywhere. We will use pseudo-classes all the time. So right now we have these two buttons. I'm going to remove the CSS file here and then select this button here. And then I'm going to add background color of blue. And by the way, for simplicity, I'm going to remove the second button and only keep the submit button. Now in the preview, we have this blue button here. Let me actually change its color to white to see that better. There you go. We can add a pseudo class to that called hover. First, we're going to select the button. So pseudo classes always start with this colon. So we add one colon and then say hover. And the hover is the state when the cursor hovers over it or goes on top of it. And then we can add specific styles for that. Let's say opacity 0.7. Now this opacity is basically the opacity, and the value for that is from 0 to 1. Here I have the button, and whenever I hover the mouse over that, there you go, you can see the opacity change. We can change any property that we want. As an example, we had the background color blue. I'm gonna copy and paste it here, and then change the blue to something lighter. I'm gonna comment opacity. Basically, let's change to something like this light coral again. And hover. There you go, you can see the background color changes. So hover is one state. We also have other states, and we have different states based on different elements. Next one, let's add the active. And let's say padding 10 pixels. So the active state basically is when we click and hold on it. So if I click, you can see padding increases and it gets bigger. And the reason for that is because this padding is here. And we also have a very popular CSS property called cursor, and we can change different styles of the cursor here. For example, if I change it to move, whenever I click on the button, you can see the cursor changes to move. Or usually we add the pointer. So cursor pointer gets added whenever we hover over the button. So when I hover over it, you can see the cursor changes to something that provides a sense of clickable item. We also have not allowed. So you can see whenever I click, it changes the cursor to something like not allowed. But we also have other pseudo classes that do not get applied to button, and we can add them to other elements like input, text, or whatever. So let's go ahead and create an input element inside the HTML. We can add a pseudo class called focus. And whenever it gets focused, we can say border 1 pixel solid red and turn the border to red for input. We can do this focus pseudo class for button as well. So here, whenever I select this, it has the border of red. Technically, you can see the red corners literally around here. The reason we don't see that is because we have something called outline. This is again a very good place to learn about the outline. So you know that in CSS box model, we have border, we have padding, margin, but we also have something called outline that is outside of this concept of box model. We can set it to none, and right now we can actually see the red borders here. If I comment to outline none, You can see whenever we focus on that, it shows this outline here. And this outline usually used for focus states and for accessibility reasons. Clicking is not the only way to focus on an element. If I click outside of element and I hit tab, you can see I just focused on this button. You can see the outline appears on the button. There you go. And if I hit the tab again, now you can see I'm focused on the input. So if I add the focus state for the button, background color of green. So if we focus on button, we can turn the background to green. So here I hit tab. There you go. Now you can see button turns green. These are the ways that we can use pseudo classes in CSS. Alright, so you can see we have different states based on the different elements, and we can add multiple pseudo classes to an element. And in our reference website, I have also mentioned a couple of other pseudo classes. Here you can see we have the hover, active, focus. We have first child, that we can select the first child and add in specific styles to that. As an example here, let's say we have a list and we have a couple of list items. We can select the first child and add specific styles to that. We have last child. We have nth child. For example, we can say nth like this. We can say list item, nth child of odd or even. Or we can say 2, 1, select a specific one. And then we also have the not, that we say, okay, the p tag that doesn't have the .intro class. So this selects all paragraphs except those with the class of intro, another cool CSS pseudo class. Now, the one that is really important is this root. So we need to talk about this because it's very important. I'm going to clear the entire CSS again, also the entire body element. Now, this root is a CSS pseudo class that represents the HTML element, this element in the CSS. And it is used to define CSS variable. So we can use it to declare CSS variables. In CSS world, we call them custom properties. So as an example, we say something like primary color. And then we say something like FC22DF. So let's say this is my primary color. This is the way that we define the variable. So instead of repeating this value around the CSS, I can only use its name. As an example, let's go ahead and create a button here. Login. Also, let's create an h1 element here and call it login and call it login. Actually, let's move this login on top of the button and then create an input element here and add the placeholder of, let's say, username, like this. So we have h1 login, input, and button. Now let's style this. Let's say I want to use my brand. I want to say h1 color. Let's not use the variables right now. And then say input color, the same color, and then button for the hover pseudo class. Let's say background color of this color. Alright, so if we take a look at that, you can see it's here, and if I type, it has the same color, and if I hover over the button, it turns to that color. So right now we have repeated this color 3 times, which is not good. Every time we want to change the color, we have to change them in all the places. But the better way is to define a variable or custom property like this, and instead of using this value directly, we can say var or variable and then the name of that variable. This is a very clean way of using this. In the preview, we still have the same styles, but now we have used the CSS properties. So it's not about colors. Remember, we can define like spacing units, we can define margin values. Usually we define design tokens in custom property or CSS variables and use those design tokens throughout the project for having a consistent brand. Before moving on, let's go ahead and talk about some other CSS properties that we haven't talked about. These are usually the utility classes, and we might use them all the time. I'm gonna keep this background color, and right now you can see, if I zoom in a little bit, you can see big border. If I select this button here, here you can see it has this property called appearance auto. Then it has font styles. These are the default styles from the browser. All the font. Then it goes to the color, letter spacing, whatever. It adds a bunch of styles to this. Now, we can reset styles of any elements inside CSS with appearance. We can say appearance none. This is the bare minimum button element that browser gives us. I can do the same. I can duplicate this down and do the same for input as well. So now another thing is border radius. And border radius is basically the radius around the border. We can say 2 pixels as an example. And you can see it turns its borders to be round. It rounds the borders. And so if I increase that here, you can see it turns, you can see. So if I change it here, you can see it changes the borders of that. And pixel is not the only unit. We can say 50% and it will make it an oval button. And if the width and height are equal, it's going to turn it into a circle. As an example, I say width 50 pixels and height 50 pixels as well. Now, with the border radius of 50%, it turns it into a round button. Next, we can actually remove the border and say border none, so that bad looking border is gone now. If I disable this border radius and width and height, we can style this really better right now. All right, so in the styles tab here, we also have this hover, which basically toggles the element state as it says. So this is a very good place to test the pseudo classes that we just learned about. As an example, I can select this hover. And when I select the hover, you can see it shows this orange kind of circle here, and it says that the element state is on hover. And the reason that we have this, if I increase this, is that we can change the styles for its hover. So if we go back to VS Code and add the hover styles, let's say I say background color to light blue. And by the way, let's remove the border here. Whenever the button gets hovered, I want to see the light blue. So right now it's in light blue. And the reason for that is because the hover state is on hover. So we don't have to manually move our cursor on top of it to see that. We have it here. All right, the last property that we're going to talk about is called pointer events. Pointer event allows us to control the interaction with an element using pointing devices like mouse, touchpad, or stylus. And in CSS, we usually set it to none to disable any interaction between the cursor and the element. So right now you can see my mouse goes on top of the button, but nothing happens. If this pointer event is really useful whenever we want to disable something or don't do anything about an element. The next topic that we're going to talk about is called pseudo elements. And this is really useful for styling parts of an element and not the entire element. And inside the technical details, you can see that I've said that pseudo elements represent abstract elements in the document tree. So we can style stuff that we don't have inside HTML. And let me just quickly show you what I mean by that. I'm going to go to the styles.css, remove everything here, and remove everything inside HTML except for this h1 element. I'm going to select the h1 and add a pseudo element of after. So this after is a famous pseudo element, and we can add pseudo elements with this double colon here. The famous property for pseudo element is called content. So we can say content and add something here. As an example, I can add an angle bracket here. If I go to the preview, you can see we have that, and I cannot select that. You can see it's not selectable. And the reason for that is because I told you that we can style stuff that are not represented inside the HTML. So here, that angle bracket is part of the pseudo element called after, and we cannot change it from HTML. Another pseudo element is called before, and this is for before the element. So now you can see that pseudo element starts at the start of the element. Usually what we do is we use an empty content like this and then style it, something like an underline or line through. For example, I can say width of 30 pixels and height of, and then turn the background color to something like light Coral 10 pixels. Also, don't forget to change its display to inline block, because by default their display is inline and we cannot add width and height to the inline element, as we talked about display and positioning part of the CSS course. So right now you can see that it shows up like this reddish box before the element. We can technically select the h1 itself and add the position of relative, and this way we can turn the position for this to absolute, make the left 0 and also the bottom 0 as well. This way it goes on the bottom of the text, and we can reduce its height as an example, so it looks like something like this, which looks nice, by the way. We can change the bottom value to make it line through, increase the width, and so it shows up like this. So you can see we can play with the pseudo elements to add some extra visuals to the HTML structure. So after and before are not the only pseudo elements that we have. One of the famous one is selection. Right now you can see whenever I select a text element, it always has this blue background. Even though the text is black, whenever I select it, text turns into white with this blue background. We can change that with selection pseudo element. So I can say selection, and I can add the color like red and background color of black as an example. So this way, whenever I select that, you can see the background turns black and the text itself is red, which comes from the selection. And another cool one is called first letter, and we can style only the first letter of this h1 element. So you can see the background color of that first letter is black and the letter itself is red. This is a cool way of styling stuff inside CSS about the pseudo elements. So this is all about the pseudo elements. You can read more about them inside the reference website. In the next video, we're going to talk about transition and transformations that are really useful for CSS animations. So see you there.